Welcome back. What are the big ideas that explain processes in the universe? Well, in the world of life, I think you can certainly say natural selection and evolution by natural selection. In the physical world, certainly gravity. There are also the laws of thermodynamics. These laws, there are a few of them. The first one is the first law of thermodynamics, the second one, the second law. And these really explain how fluids move in plants. That's what we're going to talk about today, how fluids move in plants. And this is called transport. So, first of all, we'll talk about the pathways of transport. We'll talk about water potential. We'll introduce how xylem moves, and then how phloem fluid moves. So what are these ideas? Well, the first law of thermodynamics, of course, says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's only changeable from one form to another. For example, from electricity to light. The second law of thermodynamics says that energy spontaneously tends to flow only from being concentrated in one place to becoming spread out. You can also think of it this way. For a combined system and its surroundings, entropy never decreases. That is to say, disorder never goes down. Disorder always goes up. You can think of entropy and disorder as being similar ideas. Why is this important? This is important because it explains how fluids move in plants. We're not going to be concerned with what the second law is. We only want to know how it applies to organisms. So, how does it apply? Here's the second law of thermodynamics in life. The movement of fluid in plants follows the second law. The most equitable distribution of energy corresponds to maximum entropy. That's the idea of the second law. The most equitable distribution of energy corresponds to maximum disorder. Some examples of this are osmosis, diffusion, the fluid movement because of differences in hydrostatic pressure. So higher pressure, lower pressure, fluid moves from higher to lower pressure regions. The particulars of this, how the second law applies in a physical sense, in the sense of physics, are not really important to us here. Just realize that the plant is using the second law to move fluids around. So it's pretty clever. So here's an overview of transport in the world of plants. You know that water leaves plants through leaves in particular. This is a process called transpiration. So water leaves plants through leaves, and the water is replaced. It's replaced from the soil. And the water enters the soil through the roots, moves up the stem, and out the leaves. When the water is traveling up, it also brings in inorganic ions called minerals. At the same time, there is photosynthesis occurring, so carbon dioxide is being taken in by the leaves, and photosynthesis then causes the generation of oxygen. Photosynthesis produces sugars, so the site of photosynthesis is the leaves primarily, and these sugars are then transported down the plant to other parts of the plant, including to the roots. And this is done in the presence of light. Finally, have a look at the roots. Notice that oxygen is entering the roots and carbon dioxide is leaving. That's not photosynthesis. That's respiration. This is because roots have to breathe. Roots need oxygen and they give off CO2. This is why you should never ever water a plant that has wet soil. You'll only do it harm. The only plants that this works for are plants that are specially adapted to live in waterlogged soils. But for most plants, if your plant doesn't look good, don't water it if the soil is already damp. You'll only make things worse. The roots need oxygen to survive. Water enters a plant and then moves along the plant in 3 different possible routes. That's R-O-U-T-E-S. And so here is a review at the top from your textbook of the cell compartments. So there's the cell wall, and inside the cell wall is the cell membrane, here indicated in blue, the blue line. And the cytosol, which is the part of the cytoplasm that doesn't include the organelles, is inside there. And then there's the vacuole in the center, which makes up a large part of the cell. So how does fluid move from cell to cell? Well, there are three ways. One way is called the symplastic route. In the symplastic route, fluids move through the plasmodesmata inside the cell itself, not crossing a cell membrane. The second way is called the apoplastic route. Apo means alongside. Sym means with. So symplastic is with, and apoplastic is alongside the membrane. And apoplastic flow occurs outside the cell membrane, in the cell walls and the middle lamellae. And you can see that shown here at the bottom. And then there is a combination of these two, a combination of symplastic and apoplastic called transmembrane. And the transmembrane mode of transport crosses a membrane and then goes into a cell and crosses a membrane again, crosses a cell wall, into a membrane again, etc. And so these are the three methods, the three modes of water transport or fluid transport in a plant. Cellulose is highly attractive to water. It's highly absorbent. It's hydrophilic. It is, of course, as you know, the main component of cell walls. It's a polymer made up of polysaccharides, and it's, as you recall, the most abundant organic compound on Earth. We use it to make sponges, and these are cellulose sponges shown here on the right. We use it to make rayon. We use it to make cotton. We use it to make paper. So we have fluid movement in a plant. What causes the movement? I mentioned the second law. Well, you can think about the process of movement as being the process of following water potentials. And water potential is water potential energy. It's symbolized by this Greek letter psi, psi, pronounced psi, and it's in units of megapascals. 1 megapascal is about 10 atmospheres. Water potential refers to water's capacity to perform work. Energy and entropy are intimately linked. So when I mentioned the second law earlier, and I mentioned water potential now, just realize that the second law having to do with entropy and water potential having to do with energy are intimately linked. This is outside of our discussion, but they are related to one another in a very, very tight way. Water potential determines the direction of movement of water. Water always flows from regions of higher to lower water potential. That's the key. This explains everything. Once you realize that, you understand everything about movement of fluids in plants. Water flows from regions of higher to lower water potential. This water potential combines the effects of solute concentration and pressure. There are two kinds of water potential. And water potential is 0 megapascals for pure water at sea level and at room temperature. So water potential for our purposes can be subdivided into two components. And these two components are pressure potential, psi sub p, and solute potential, psi sub s. Total water potential at any spot in the organism is the sum of pressure potential and solute potential. So here are the two components, and this from your text is a nice way to understand them. So if you look at the far left, you can see this tube, and the tube has water in it, a U-shaped tube with water. And in the middle is a membrane that's permeable to water, but not to anything else that you might put in, like sugar or salt. So on the far left, if you add sugar or salt and it's dissolved, these are called solutes, you can see now that the water has raised on the right-hand side, the side with the solutes in it. Why has the water level gone up? It's because water has moved into that region. Water has moved into it. The system is increasing in entropy, and the system is having water potential drive this. So the water potential of a region with solutes is lower than the water potential without solutes. The water potential of a region with solutes is lower than the region without solutes. So pure water has a water potential of 0, and water with solutes in it has a water potential less than 0. So here you have the movement of water from 0 to the negative regions of water potential, the region with the solute, and that's why that water climbs. Okay, that's solute potential. Solutes decrease water potential. So if we move to the second panel, we have our pure water at equilibrium in the top, and then we apply positive pressure. So imagine you take a plunger and you push down on it. That's positive pressure. When you do that, the water flows through the semi-permeable membrane and travels up the left side of this U-shaped tube. That's positive pressure. We all have an intuitive understanding of that. Now, you have a higher level on the left. Let's move to the third panel. If you have solutes on the right and the water has moved up, as you saw in panel 1, and you push down with positive pressure, you can push down hard enough so that the water levels are the same in the left and the right sides of this U-shaped tube. So what you've just done is taken the negative potential of the solutes and balanced it by the positive pressure potential. And here you can see that the sum of pressure potential and solute potential adds up to the total water potential. So you've made it 0 again. You can also apply negative pressure. So pressure can be either positive or negative. And negative pressure is basically suction. So if you pull up on one side of the tube, in this case on the far right panel, you can see the right side of the tube, you will cause negative pressure there. And because water potential always causes water to move from higher to lower potential, water is moving from the 0 potential on the left to the negative potential on the right. And the potential on the right is negative because of the negative pressure component. Here's water potential in plant cells. Water potential in plant cells you can think of in this way. This is a nice diagram from your textbook. Start with a flaccid cell. That is a cell that's not pushing outward. Its membrane is contacting the cell wall, but it's flaccid. It's just doesn't have a lot of pressure inside. So the pressure potential is 0 by definition here. Let's imagine that for our beginning case. And there are, of course, some solutes in the cell. So we have a flaccid cell. This flaccid cell is not bursting. It's not pushing out strongly. It's also not particularly collapsing. So the pressure potential inside is 0. The solute potential is less than 0. And that's because solutes make water potential less than 0. So in this case, it's negative 0.7. The total water potential, therefore, is negative 0.7 megapascals in this cell. Let's drop this cell in sugar water. Well, of course, sugar water has a negative water potential because a solute reduces the water potential to below 0. And in this case, it's minus 0.9 megapascals. So which is lower, the water potential in the cell or the water potential in the sugar solution? It's the sugar solution. Minus 9 is lower than minus 7. Therefore, the fluid in the cell will flow outward from the cell into the sugar solution. And that's because the water moves from higher to lower water potential. This can cause the cell to become plasmolyzed. That's the loss of water from the cell. The cell membrane in plasmolysis becomes separated from the cell wall. And this is generally something that the cell might not be able to tolerate for a very long period of time. Okay, now let's put the cell in pure water. We start with our flaccid cell, which has a total water potential of minus 0.7 megapascals, and we plop it into pure water. Pure water has a total water potential of 0. So now the cell's water potential is less than the water potential of the surrounding water. Water moves from higher to lower, so water will move into the cell from the surroundings. Water goes from 0 to minus 7 megapascals. 0 is bigger than minus 0.7. So now the cell membrane is pushing out against the cell wall, and you can say the cell is turgid. So that's water potential, and water potential has two parts. So our first type of movement is movement in xylem, and water and minerals are what move in xylem, and they travel upward. They travel in tracheids in all vascular plants, and they travel in vessel elements in all of the flowering plants. So flowering plants have tracheids and vessel elements, and other vascular plants have tracheids only in their xylem. And you can see here tracheids and vessel elements, a slide you've seen before, and the vessel elements are wider and they're stacked on top of one another, whereas tracheids are narrower and they have tapered ends. These tapered ends then align with one another, and fluids flow through these tapered parts that are in contact. The ascent of sap occurs in xylem. Sap is a technical term in biology. Sap is what moves upward through xylem. So if you climb a pine tree and get sticky stuff on your hands, that's not sap. It's okay to call it sap, but it's not technically sap. Sap is instead that material that's inside xylem, and it is water and minerals, and it comes from the soil and travels upward through the plant and out the leaves. And here you can see shoots, you can see roots, you can see a woody plant. So these are typical sorts of structures shown in cross-section through which water and minerals flow. Here's an herbaceous root, that is to say one that's not woody, and it has a vascular cylinder in the center. This vascular cylinder has an X shape, so you know it's a eudicot root. There's the thick cortex in this particular example. It's a buttercup. And the epidermis. Now somehow, this root has to get water and minerals into the center part. How does that happen? How can water get to the center part so it can move through the plant? Well, it happens this way. It happens by coming in through a root hair. So if you look at the bottom, you can see a root hair, a single cell that's an epidermal cell. This root hair has water entering, and you can see there's an apoplastic root that is going through the cell walls, and there's the symplastic root that's entering inside the cell and traveling inside the cell only, from cell to cell. This water and mineral combination flows from the outside toward the stele, toward the vascular cylinder, and it does that by either one of these roots, and it encounters this special layer that we mentioned last time called the endodermis. This endodermis is a very important layer of cells. It's a single cell layer thick, it's a ring, and it has wax in its cell walls. This wax is called suberin, and the wax in the walls makes what's called the Casparian strip. What this means is that as water flows in from out toward the inside, toward the vascular tissues, the water gets stopped by the Casparian strip if the water is in the cell walls. If the water is in the cell walls, the water is shunted around and has to enter the endodermal cell. It has to go into it through the membrane to get into the vascular tissues. So this is a really cool way for the plant to have a check. It's like checkpoint Charlie. It's a check to say, I'm not going to let you in, or I am going to let you in. So any water that's not already in the symplastic root, that is, that's not already inside the cells, has to go inside the cell to get into the vascular tissues. That is to say, it has to enter the cell membrane of the endodermis to get inside the vascular tissues. So this endodermis is a protective layer. It's protective because of the Casparian strip that takes up a strip in the cell walls and the middle lamellae, completely preventing the passage of water. So here's the endodermis. It's a cylinder. It is one cell thick. It occurs in the roots. Remember that the stele is all the material inside the endodermis. That is the xylem and the phloem, and any pith that might be in there, any ground tissue that might be in there. And it includes the pericycle just inside, and that is the origin of lateral roots. The Casparian strip is a strip of waxy material that's in the primary wall and the middle lamella. It takes the place of the primary wall and the middle lamella. It's waterproof. It's impermeable to ions. It's made up of suberin, a wax. All the ions and all the water entering the xylem must pass through the endodermal cells. That is to say, they must cross a membrane. So here's a movie from your textbook, an animation of transport in roots. Here we go.
As a plant lives and grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide and oxygen from the air and water and minerals from the soil. How does the plant move these substances to where they are needed for chemical reactions such as photosynthesis? Water and minerals are transported upward within the xylem as xylem sap. First, however, water and minerals are absorbed by the roots, so we will start there. The surface area of a root is enormously expanded by thousands of root hairs and symbiotic mycorrhizae. The root hairs are in direct contact with water and dissolved inorganic ions held in tiny spaces between soil particles. Water and ions can travel into the root by the apoplastic route, moving between cells and along cell walls, or by the symplastic route, moving from cell to cell through plasmodesmata. A molecule or ion may also move through the root via a combination of these two routes, or by moving slowly from cell to cell across plasma membranes and cell walls. All water and ions eventually have to pass through cell membranes, and this is how the plant controls their uptake. Even water and ions that are traveling by the apoplastic route must eventually pass through cells because of a waxy waterproof band called the Casparian strip. This forces all water and solutes to pass through the plasma membranes of endodermis cells, and thus these cells are able to exert ultimate control over the kinds and amounts of substances that enter the plant. Once the selected solutes and water are in the endodermis cells, they can be discharged into the xylem for transport to the rest of the plant.
Okay, so you might notice in your textbook a description of how solutes are actually transported across plant cell membranes. You can have a look at that if you're interested. We're not going to talk about that in any detail in this course. One thing I'd like you to know is that plant roots have associated with them a fungus. And depending on the species of plant, it's a particular species of fungus or maybe a few species. And these fungi are called mycorrhizae. Myco means fungus, and rhiza refers to root. So it's a fungus that is associated with a plant root, and mycorrhizae are mutualisms. It's a mutualism between the plants and the fungi. The mutualism benefits both players. So the plant benefits by having an increase in ions, an increase in the uptake of minerals, and the fungus benefits by getting photosynthetic products, mostly sugars, from the plant. Mycorrhizae increase the surface area for absorption of water and minerals, and they aid, of course, in the absorption of minerals. So water enters a root, and then what happens? What next? Well, it goes from the soil to the root hair, or through mycorrhizae, into the cortex, into the endodermis, crossing the Casparian strip, into the xylem, up the plant, and out into the atmosphere. How do minerals and water move up a plant? What are the possibilities? Well, one possibility is capillary action. You know capillary action. Capillary action is what draws water up the sides of narrow tubes. This cannot explain, however, the movement of water up great distances. It only works for short distances. What about pumps? What about pumps from above? Pumps from below? Well, there is no pump from above. There's nothing sucking as a pump from above. From below, there are roots, and roots do push water up, but they don't play a role that's big enough to move the water up tall trees or even small plants. You do occasionally see water coming out of leaves in the morning, and this is because the roots are pushing water up through the plant and it's coming out the edges of the leaves. The final possibility is transpiration, cohesion, and tension working together. And this is what is now believed to be the main mechanism of movement of water in plants. In leaves, there is a pull of water, and this is called transpirational pull. As water leaves the plant through the leaf, through an opening in the leaf, this pulls water up through the plant. The details of this are shown here, and we're not really going to be concerned with the actual details of what's going on in a leaf, but realize that water is being pulled up through the plant because water is lost through the leaf. And here we go. So the ascent of sap. Here is the transpiration, tension, cohesion mechanism. First of all, water evaporates from the moist cells in the leaf openings. Those are called stomates. And this is the transpiration step. And that's because the atmosphere has an extraordinarily low water potential. The atmosphere has a very low water potential. You know, if you hang jeans out on a line and the jeans are soaking wet, that they will become dry after a while. That's because the water leaves the plant and goes into the atmosphere. The atmosphere has a very strong drying capacity. After transpiration, the water potential is then lowered in this air-to-water interface in the leaf, causing a negative pressure in the xylem, right there at the stomate and in the xylem tissue of the leaf. This negative pressure is known as tension. Now, of course, hydrogen bonds hold water molecules together. This is called cohesion. Water molecules like each other. They stick together. They are cohesive. So the xylem is under a tension gradient. There's a pressure potential that's the lowest at the top. It's most negative at the top. So water is pulled up by a pressure gradient. That is, differences in pressure potential and not in solute potential. So water is moving up because it's going from higher to lower water potential. Finally, water enters the root by osmosis, and that's driven by a difference in solute potential. So this is called the transpiration tension cohesion mechanism. The total path in xylem is always from the highest to the lowest water potential. Said a different way, it's from the least negative to the most negative water potential, highest to lowest. It's a passive process, and that's really, really cool. The plant has figured out a way to have water move up through its tissues without spending any energy. Water moves up through the dead xylem cells passively. So xylem flow is upward movement of water and minerals from the soil in the xylem and out into the atmosphere. And here is a movie from your textbook that explains what we just talked about.
How does water get from the roots of a tree to its leaves? The evaporation of water from leaves moves water molecules up from the roots. The evaporation exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root. Hydrogen bonds cause water molecules to stick together, a phenomenon called cohesion. As each water molecule evaporates, it pulls on the next water molecule, and it pulls on the next. This relays the pull of evaporating water molecules all the way down to the roots. The cohesion of water helps to keep gravity from pulling the water molecules back down.
So that's the ascent of sap, the transpiration tension cohesion mechanism. It's a passive process. This is extremely important. It's a passive process. The plant has figured out a way to set up a system so that water moves through it passively. Every time it requires water, which is all the time, it doesn't have to expend energy. Water simply moves passively up through the xylem tissue. The total path is always from the least negative to the most negative water potential. And you can see some examples here in this diagram. The water moves from the soil into the root xylem because in the root xylem, the water potential is lower than it is in the soil. So the water moves passively into the root. At the top, the atmosphere has the lowest water potential of all, and it pulls the water up. So you should think of the water as being pulled up like ropes through the organism. It's pulled up like ropes, and the water holds together because of the cohesion component of this theory. Plants can control how water is removed. Plants can control how often water is removed and how much of it is removed. They do this by opening and closing openings called stomates. So transpiration is controlled by stomates. Stomates open at dawn. They are cued by light. They are cued by carbon dioxide depletion inside the leaf, and they are also cued by a circadian rhythm. Plants have circadian rhythms. In dry conditions, the stomate closes. This is because the plant is preventing the loss of more water, so the stomate will close. So you can see here that a stomate is made up of two special cells. These are called guard cells. Guard cells look like sausages, and the guard cells have this special arrangement of microfibrils you can see here. And the microfibril arrangement is such that when the cell is flaccid, the cells collapse and they close the stomate. And when the cell is turgid, that is under positive pressure, the stomate is open. So if you look at the top, you can see an open stomate on the left and that is a pair of cells that are turgid. These cells are called guard cells. On the right, the cells have become flaccid. That is, they've lost their positive pressure, and now they have zero pressure or negative pressure, and those flaccid cells are now closed. The guard cells are closed, the stomate is closed. How does this happen? Well, under dry conditions, a hormone called abscisic acid is used, and this causes potassium to leave the guard cells. Abscisic acid causes potassium to leave the guard cells. And so this results in the stomate's closure. Why? Because of water potential. If you look at the lower left diagram, you can see that potassium ions exist in higher concentration inside the cell, and therefore water flows into the cell because the high concentration of potassium ions lowers the water potential there. That's your basic idea, that increasing solute concentration decreases water potential, in particular the solute component. Therefore, water flows in and the cells are turgid. In the lower right, water flows out because the potassium ions have left because of abscisic acid. So abscisic acid is a hormone that causes potassium ions to leave the guard cells. So abscisic acid is associated with the closure of stomates in dry conditions. Here you can see a photomicrograph of an open stoma or stomate, same thing, on the left, and a closed one on the right. Here are some stomates. These are in different species. Here's a rose in the middle, in the top. Here's a lily of the valley, a bird of paradise, a horsetail, a sweet potato. And you can see that there are fantastic arrangements of waxes on the cuticles of these structures. You can only see this with a microscope. So here from your book is another explanation of how fluids move in plants. This is water transport. So that's xylem transport. That's the movement of water and minerals upward in a plant. There's another type of movement, and that's called phloem transport, and that's the movement of sugar and other dissolved substances in the plant. Phloem transport, unlike xylem transport, occurs in all directions. How does this occur? Well, first of all, it occurs in the sieve tube elements, or sieve elements, and it occurs by a process called the pressure flow hypothesis. Here's how it works. Imagine that you have a source area and a sink area. So the source area is where the fluid starts, and the sink area is where the fluid is going to end up. In this particular example, we have a source leaf cell, and it's shown at the top of your diagram here. And it's photosynthesizing, so it's making sugar. The sugar is sucrose. And the sucrose is transferred into a sieve tube element. And the sieve tube element, of course, is the phloem, and it's transferred into there. Now, once the material, the solute, is placed into the sieve tube element, this lowers the water potential, as you know, because solutes lower the water potential. That means that water will now spontaneously flow into that area. Water is nearby. In this case, there's a vessel from the xylem nearby, and water flows from the xylem over into this area. This builds up hydrostatic pressure. That is to say, it builds up pressure potential. So the pressure potential is now higher in this area. It's higher than it is in other areas of the sieve tube. So the water will flow from higher to lower water potential. And it flows, therefore, from the source area down to other regions, the sink areas. In this particular example, that's shown at the bottom. So here we have a root cell, and that is where the sugar will end up. And the water flows down with its dissolved sugar molecules. And then the sucrose is transported actively, it takes energy, actively transported out into a storage cell, in this case in the root. That sucrose then builds up in that storage cell, and the plant will do whatever it wants with it, maybe turn it into starch for storage. So you can now see that the water has flowed from the top to the bottom, and the water now is going to leave and go back into the xylem. Now, there's something really cool here. You'll notice that the sucrose is being actively transported into the root cell on the right. That should lower the water potential there, shouldn't it? That's what we've been saying. So why do you see water flowing back into the xylem on the left? The only possible answer is that the plant has figured out a way to make the water potential in the xylem even lower than it is in the cell with the sucrose concentration. So the water always goes from higher to lower water potential. This is it. It's the pressure flow hypothesis. Here's an example of sources and sinks in a real organism. You can see here, this is a nice diagram from your text. There is sugar that's being actively transported into the sieve tube members of the phloem, and water flows into the sieve tube then by osmosis, just going across into the cell. And that's because of a lowered water potential there, and then that builds up pressure, and the higher pressure then causes the water to flow from higher pressure to lower pressure down to the sink area. So what are these sources and sinks? Well, in a plant, they can differ. A source and a sink can be the same tissue at different times of the year. So what's a source and what's a sink just depends on how the plant has set this up. So for example, in the summer and in the fall, the leaves are making glucose by photosynthesis. They turn this into sucrose, and the sucrose is what travels down the stem and can be stored in the roots as starch. So in this case, in the summer and fall, the leaves are the source and the roots are the sink. However, after winter, when spring comes, the plant needs to mobilize the energy in the roots to other parts of the plant so it can grow its new leaves and its new shoots. So now the root is the source, and the starch is dissolved into sugars. The starch is converted into sugars and moved upward to the leaves. So in the spring, the roots are the source and the leaves are the sink. So sources and sinks. Here's how your book presents translocation of sap. What if you're an aphid? If you're an aphid, you live on sugar water. If you're an aphid, you have a mouth part called a stylet, and you stick it into a plant. If you're an aphid, it's important that you stick your stylet into a phloem tube, because xylem is under negative pressure. If you make a mistake and you stick your stylet into xylem, it will pull the fluid out of your body. Instead, if you stick your stylet into phloem, which is under positive pressure, then the phloem will naturally push its sugar water into your body. Fabulous. So you can see here a stylet from an aphid that's stuck into a sieve tube member. So, the keys to understanding movement of fluids in plants. Transport within plants occurs because of water potential differences. Water potential is the sum of pressure potential and solute potential. The total water potential is what matters. Water spontaneously moves from regions of higher to regions of lower water potential, also called water potential energy. In any region, water potential energy is the sum of these two components, the solute or osmotic potential, and this can be either 0 or negative, and the pressure potential, which can be negative, 0, or positive, any value. There are two main tissues for transport. The xylem transports sap, that is water and minerals, and it does so upward in the plant. The phloem transports sugar water, sucrose in particular, in sieve tube elements, and it does so in any direction. And here is a summary of these tissues and what they do. So this is how fluids move in plants. They all obey the second law of thermodynamics. They all obey how the water potential differences play out in a plant. Always, fluids move from higher to lower water potential energy. Next time, we'll talk about how hormones influence plant processes and how photosynthesis occurs. See you then.